Hey, Janette, thanks for joining today. We're excited to have you. And this is part of a series that Foster, which is a co-writing group and a community that they host. And we try to bring in interesting writers with a unique perspective, and hopefully we can learn together and learn from your experience. And this will get published, I think, in the next couple of days on the Faster podcast page, so people can listen to it later as well. So I want to introduce Janette to the group. Janette has become a friend over the last maybe 18 months. She has a very interesting background. She writes a weekly newsletter called Prime Future, which is focused on animal agriculture, which sounds sort of very niche and esoteric, but if you think about it, unless you are like a hardcore vegan, and even if you're a vegan, I think what she writes about will impact you in terms of what we eat and how it's produced, etc. Currently, she works as a VC at Merck Animal Ventures, I guess it's called. And before that, she had her own. She was an entrepreneur. She had her own consulting business, and so she's seen all kinds of situations in terms of growing her business, growing her leadership. And so that's why I thought this would be an interesting session for us to learn from her. So with that quick introduction, we have a bunch of topics that we want to get into. And maybe DJ, if you want to introduce yourself, she's going to be my co-host here.
Hey, I'm DJ. I also kind of write about agriculture for 3 different academic societies. So a little bit of overlap there. Yeah, but I'm curious, we've never talked before, but can you give us a backstory about how you knew you wanted to be a writer and how that fits in with what you do now?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, it's good to be here with all of you. Actually, this is a really fun day because Rhishi and I have actually never spoken. We're just Twitter friends and newsletter friends. And so this is very exciting. So good to be here with all of you. Yeah, so I mean, like the existential answer to that question is that when I was in kindergarten, my teachers wanted me to color, and they would pass out a paper that had like, a outline of a cucumber or something and say like, color the picture. And I hated coloring, and I would turn over the picture and I would write a story on the back. Like, I want words, I don't want crayons. And so I feel like that's kind of representative of my life. I'm not an artist unless if writing is an art form, but from a professional standpoint, so actually, so Rhishi mentioned that I had launched a company. So I launched a startup really working on the problem of price discovery in poultry. And during that time, we were nobody from nowhere trying to, shout into the void of the industry to get some attention. And I just found that content was a really good way to do it. I could write pretty provocative things and that would, get people's attention. I also, during that time, so that was like, say, 2016, 2017, there was an industry publication that I started submitting some of those blog pieces to. And they were really interested in them because, like with most industries, right, people inside don't sometimes say the things that need to be said out loud. Everyone whispers them around the corner of the room instead of saying them out loud. And I was saying some things pretty loudly that everybody kind of knew, but wasn't talking about. And so they started running those blogs occasionally. Then that startup, I ended up shutting it down, joined a venture-backed company out of San Francisco as head of commercial. And then again, just was like, hey, I've got this like content creation muscle that I built over here. Let me bring that over here. By that point, the industry publication was like, oh, well, this is pretty good stuff. Would you be interested in like a once a month, column with us? And I was like, yeah, that would be awesome. That sounds great. So I started doing it. So you guys kind of want the nitty gritty, I'm assuming, since we're talking about writing here and what that process is like. So I started doing it. I was being told by the people at that publication, like, we're getting really good reviews. You're getting a lot of good traffic to the website, all of that. I wasn't being paid for it, right? And they're telling me that like they had probably 10 contributing columnists at that time. They're telling me that like my work is generating better results than everyone else, but like I'm not getting paid for it. So I approached them and was like, hey, I'm seeing that you're starting to put ads on my pieces. So that tells me you're generating direct revenue off of my work, and I would like a piece of that. And they said, but that's not our model, so we can't do that. And I was like, right, but like we can change the model. We can have a conversation about this, surely, right? I'm reasonable, and I'm open to a discussion of how this can work for everyone. And they're like, that's not our model, so we can't do that. And so just, I had a moment of principle and was like, yeah, I am not writing for you guys anymore. And so that for me was probably when I realized that I needed my own distribution. And so let's say that was like mid 2019. I just kind of poked around and was thinking about what I wanted to do for a while. And then, long story short, left that company that I was with at the end of 2019. Then the pandemic hit, and I ended up relocating from San Francisco to, this is my parents' farm on the picture behind me, to here, middle of nowhere in Southern Arizona. And we're at the beginning of the pandemic, nobody's in person. And I was like, I need connection with the outside world. And so that was really what prompted me to start Prime Future and just commit to like, okay, here we go. On a weekly basis, I'm doing the thing, I'm writing. And so that was kind of how the timing worked out. But for me, it was very much about, I'm doing this as a way to connect with people that want to talk about the things that I want to talk about. And I was pleasantly surprised at how quickly, I got traction. Again, it's a space that, it sounds like a niche space, but when you combine livestock and meat across pork, beef, and poultry, you're close to $500 billion of the economy, right? So it's a big industry. And so have been writing consistently. And I would say actually that's how I got this role, right? My current role in corporate venture capital. Substack sends me an email, every person that subscribes. And as all good writers do, I go on LinkedIn and I stalk these people. And if they look interesting, then I send them an email and say, hey, can we have a 30-minute intro call? And I did that with the gentleman that's the head of the ventures team. I just sent him an email and said, hey, can we chat? He said yes. And then the whole opportunity blew from there. So in the realm of like using writing as a way to just have interesting conversations, find the people I want to work with who are interested in the things I am interested in. That's something that I found to be, kind of my favorite part of writing. So that's a long answer to your short question.
No, that's great context though, because I'm curious. I mean, you said you wrote about things that like people would whisper around corners, but wouldn't say out loud. How did you get the guts to start writing about that stuff, especially in industry? I feel like that could be a tough thing to say.
Yeah. Well, at that time, it was because at the time when I was like being super provocative, I would say I'm not that provocative now. I still try to be provocative, right? But not in the same way or on the same topics as I was then. In terms of like how you get the guts, you're just trying to build brand, you're trying to get attention. So like the more provocative, the better. And not in like a silly way, but in a like, just, you basically have no downside of saying the thing that needs to be said. And then putting the logic and reason around it. Right. But yeah, when you're trying to build a brand, build a company and build credibility that you're someone who has spent time on these problems and understands like, this is the reason that we're bringing this solution to market. It's kind of like, you don't even think about the guts of it because it's like, this is a path and I'm going to take any door open to me. And this is the one. So here we go.
Your pieces are really well researched, and I'm curious how you get the ideas to keep putting out such well-researched pieces weekly for Prime Future.
Well, I appreciate that. I guess I would say this, some of it is from the fact that, I have spent my entire career in this space. And so, sometimes I'm drawing on something that I learned last week. Sometimes I'm drawing on something that I learned 12 years ago and everything in between. Right. And I talk to a lot of people. I read a lot of things. I also really find it's the combination of industry insights with non-industry insights. I love those combinations of bringing something in from the outside and how does this connect to the inside. I like that type of approach. I would also just say I find the value of just picking up the phone and calling someone and saying, hey, I have some questions, can we talk about this? Is really helpful. And I find people to be very, very, very generous with their insights and with their time. Sometimes I ask questions that people are like, hey, I'm not comfortable answering that no problem. Sometimes people say, I'm happy to talk with you and give you background on that, but like, I don't want my name mentioned in this, no problem. So just being aware of that. But there are a lot of conversations that I've had and topics that I've learned about that I really didn't know much about them beyond what, you know, any reporter was writing on them in the news, and just reached out to some people on LinkedIn and they said, sure, I'm happy to chat with you. And now those are people that are part of my, you know, my circle. Like I can go to them and ask them follow-up questions and that kind of thing. I think in general, just something I've observed is that there tend to be two types of people in the world. There are people who are very generous and want to share their insights, and they want to help, you know, transfer knowledge and information, and they want to advance everyone. And then there are people, and I would just say that's like abundance mindset type people. And then there are people that are the opposite, and they want to keep the information for themselves. The concern is that if you have the information that I have, then, you know, I'm somehow less valuable. I think that's very much a scarcity mindset. And I don't tend to have a lot of interactions with those types of folks, just by default, right? But there are a lot of abundance mentality people out there who are interested in, okay, how do we continue advancing the conversation in meaningful ways? And so I just spend a lot of time talking to people.
Well, I mean, you are talking to a group of writers. Can we get a little bit into like the nitty gritty of your process on a weekly basis? So do you have like a running list of ideas? Like, where are you keeping these, and what does it look like when you're developing a piece for like the next newsletter?
Yeah. So I'm a little bit nervous to share my process with a group of writers, because you guys are going to say like, oh, that's a terrible process, Janette. So I use Evernote as my repository for all the things from my brain. I do keep a couple of, I kind of do it this way. I have one page that's like, these are just things I want to go learn about, right? Like, I don't know a lot about them. I want to go learn about them. Then I have one that's things that I would like to write about. I know something about this and I would like to write about this at some point. And then sometimes it's like a phrase, and that's what I start with. Sometimes I start with kind of an outline or kind of like the first paragraph. And so then what I do is in Evernote, I just open a page and I put down like, okay, here's the concept. And then here's the first paragraph. And that's all I do with it. And I have probably 30 of those. And so then I come back and I do try to have a content calendar of here's where I think I'm going for the next 4 to 6 weeks. Sometimes I have that, it's like I have the next 10 weeks mapped, and sometimes I don't know, it's Friday and I don't know what I'm publishing Tuesday. Like I totally have those moments as well. I see heads nodding, so I know we can all relate to that. But then what I kind of do is, you know, I do publish on Tuesdays. So what I try to do is Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, just do like, write all the words, every single word that could possibly be written. And then kind of Saturday, Sunday, narrow that back down. And then Monday, go through once or twice and just refine it. And then I'm publishing on Tuesday. That's in an ideal world, but I will say there are a lot of times that like I'm writing all the words on Sunday and editing on Monday and doing one last pass Tuesday before I publish. And, you know, so it's kind of all over the board. It also depends for me whether I'm kind of getting more into these, into series and doing like 3 to 4 weeks on one topic. I think I like that format a lot, actually. And so I have historically done a lot of just every week is a new topic, all within the bucket of innovation around animal ag, but every week is a new topic. And so that tends to lend itself more to the sporadic nature of, let me go back and grab one of these pages of the 30, you know, different ideas that I have. Let me just grab one on Thursday and see where it goes. But the series kind of forces me to be a little bit more disciplined and think ahead, and I need to have calls this week for content that I'm going to write about next week to publish the following week. It just takes more planning. And the cold hard reality of it is that sometimes that just the more sporadic pieces, I just have to do that. If I'm traveling for work these couple of weeks, then I just need to get content out so that I'm being consistent. But I know, you know, I'm pulling from something previously that maybe isn't as well researched. Maybe it's more just opinion, that kind of thing. So it's a pretty loosey-goosey process. I'll say it that way.
Yeah, I'm curious because you have a full-time job as well. Is all
I
this
do.
happening like in the evenings? Like when are you making the time for these calls?
Yeah. So two things that are advantages here. One is that I live in Arizona, and I work remotely, but I work on East Coast hours. So I usually start at 5 and finish somewhere around 2, right? 1 to 2. And what I do then is I go for a walk and clear my head, refresh, whatever. And then I can kind of transition into a couple of hours of prime future. So some days that's writing, some days that's phone calls, but I kind of consider that like 3 to 5 p.m. is kind of my prime future time. And then on the weekends, I set aside a few hours for it as well. The one thing I have going for me is that I'm a pretty fast writer, which is both a blessing and a curse, because I can get like 90% of the way there really quickly. Like I can pump out a piece in like 2 hours, right? I don't like editing. I hate going back and reading it because then I start to doubt it and I'm like, oh, this is stupid. I shouldn't even publish this. And I have to just really beware of the imposter syndrome spiral. But that's something that I've got to get a lot better about, is having an editing process and being disciplined about that, because I know that that's where the magic happens and that's where you refine it so that people actually get what you're saying. I know that. I just am not diligent about it or good at it. So that's an area I've got to improve.
I guess I have 2 questions about the editing. So like one is, do you ever have anyone read it? Like, do you ever show it to anyone before you hit send to your subscribers?
Okay, so I do, but I don't do it all the time. And honestly, I only do it when I'm like, I think there's a 50% chance this is really, really good. There's also a 50% chance this is like the dumbest thing I've ever said out loud. And so when I have those weeks, which let's say it's like, I don't know, every 3rd week or something like that, I copy by that point, I usually have it already loaded in Substack, and I just copy the text out, put it in an email, and I send it to a couple of friends and say, hey, I need a sanity check here. Like, is this stupid or is it legit? And those are friends that, they kind of know this is my process. They know that they're like my imposter syndrome buffers. Thankfully, they will tell me like, okay, I see what you're doing, but I think if you did this, it would make it better, or publish as is, whatever it is. So I don't have anyone that I consistently send it to every week to say, hey, will you look this over and give me your, suggestions on how to improve it. I don't have that. So
I love the phrase imposter syndrome buffers. Like, I'm going to co-opt that. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I am curious. So what do you think it is about reading it or going back and editing on like Monday or Sunday that makes you doubt what you've written?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a great question. I should probably explore that with my therapist. I don't know. I'm just kidding.
Right, yeah,
sort of. Yeah, just kidding, sort of. I was listening to a podcast that Shane Parrish did with Walter Isaacson. I love Walter Isaacson's writing. Like, he is one of my favorite authors. But he was talking about how his process is that every night he prints out what he wrote that day, and then he starts the next morning by reading it, because he says it just hits me different on paper than it does on the screen. And that occurred to me. I've never once done that. And I wonder, that's something I want to incorporate into my process of, at least, maybe it's like on whether it's Sunday night or Monday night, but once it's close to a final form, printing it off and looking at it just, with a red pen in hand, I think that could be a really helpful addition to the process. So that's something I want to steal that idea from Walter Isaacson.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I definitely do that before I send a piece to my editor, just because I find things that you totally miss when it's on a screen. I'll be like, oh, I made that point twice, like a page ago. Like, what am I doing?
Yeah. I think, I guess I will say this also, as I think about it, to your question of why do I have a hard time with the editing and why does that make me question everything, is I think it's because like that editing process, you could do it forever. right? Like you could spend hours and hours and hours and hours just refining and moving this word and then that word and then this word. And I kind of just have this mentality of like, if I'm going to do this every week, I can only commit so much time to it. And so I have to, good enough has to be good enough in order for me to do this and have a full-time job. So I think there's some like mental trap about that, if I can't start editing too hard or else I would not be able to get out of the rabbit hole. You know what I'm saying? So I think there's an element of that to it.
Yeah, like the newsletter kind of is an accountability tool, like just to get things out.
Right. That's right. Yeah. There's a forcing function of you got to publish some idea every week. There have been a few weeks that I haven't, but it was when it was like, I just don't have the capacity and I'm giving myself the permission of I'm human and I'm not going to publish something this week and that's okay. But it's only been a very few times.
Fantastic. I'm going to pass the mic to Rhishi actually.
Yeah, thanks, TJ, and thanks, Janette. It's been a fascinating conversation so far. I'm curious about your background as a VC and as an entrepreneur. Like, are there sort of learnings from that experience that you apply to writing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think like personal opinion that what makes writing interesting is when people bring all the experiences and all the perspectives to it so that you get something with more depth. And so, yeah, I would say like all of my experiences have contributed, to how I write and to my point of view of the world. I like I say, I've spent my whole career around animal ag, and I've spent the last several years around the startup ecosystem. And so I think that for me anyway, I feel like an advantage that I've had that has served me well, that it may stop serving me well, but I think it will continue to serve me well, is having multiple viewpoints on this ecosystem, right? Like I worked for the big corporate selling products, right? Just straight commercial. I've been a founder. I've been a head of commercial. I've, now getting some more of the investor side, being a consultant, working with a lot of different startups and with VCs. So I feel like it's that like having multiple perspectives that allows me to have a point of view that maybe some people in the industry that have only been in one role or one type of company for a very long time. I think they appreciate that, being able to pull in different viewpoints. So I think the answer is yes, absolutely. I think every experience kind of shapes how we look at things, sometimes in ways that I don't even realize, right? But it's very much there.
One more question on, working full-time and writing at the same time, right? Mm-hmm. And you write about topics that are part of your day-to-day job or work, whatever you do. Mm-hmm. How do you balance that in terms of making sure there are no conflicts of interest, or like is that something that you worry about, and how do you manage that process?
Yeah, no, we put really firm guidelines in place when I started of here's what's off limits, and I have the utmost respect for those limits, and I don't get anywhere close to them because I know if I do, that it jeopardizes the whole thing, right? So yes, my employer and I, we sat down and put those limits in place, those guidelines. What are the guidelines here? And I stay far from them. There are a lot of topics that I would have loved to write about in the last 6 months that I haven't, because I just don't want to jeopardize and don't want to get anywhere close to those guidelines. But I find like once I just accepted those are the rules of the game, play within it, it really isn't an issue. And, I don't feel like it's a barrier. It's just, those are the guidelines right now while I'm full-time in this role. So it just kind of is what it is. And I just navigate around it. But there are definitely a lot of things that I would have probably written about in the last 6 months were I still a rogue independent as opposed to being part of a big company.
And are those guidelines mostly around topics, or are there guidelines or maybe unwritten rules about, how you talk about things, the tone of your writing? I mean, are they? Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, it's mainly like, I'm not ever going to mention a competitor. I'm not ever going to talk about a customer in a negative way. I'm not ever going to talk about company strategy. It's those types of guidelines.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's also why, like, I'm really clear about So right now I'm gearing up to do a whole series on, kind of the freight, transportation, supply chain situation in the world and how that's impacting livestock, meat, and poultry. And so my research around that is in my off hours, right? That's my 3 to 5 p.m. in the afternoon after I've done my full day's work. That's on my time. So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I compartmentalize it is, those calls when I reach out to people and say, hey, can we have a conversation about XYZ? I'm really clear about like, hey, this is for Prime Future. This is not for my day job. And so, there's kind of an irony in that it would honestly probably be easier if I were writing about like, shoes or cars or something completely unrelated to my work. But the reason that I'm in the role I'm in is because of my writing in this space, and my writing in this space brings opportunities to me for my work. And so it's just, there's a little bit of a messiness there. And I just really try to keep those boundaries clean, and like I say, just, be very clear about what the guidelines are and stay far away from them.
Right.
And I think, you've obviously navigated this too. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just
no, go ahead.
I think this is something that more big companies, they're just going to have to figure it out, right? Like, tell me where the line is between Substack, between releasing something on Substack and writing an article on LinkedIn. And tell me where the line is between writing an article on LinkedIn and putting some thoughts in a post on LinkedIn, right? And it's all squishy. And at some point, like every company is just going to have to trust their employees to be smart online. And, I also just think the additive value of having people, that have a point of view, that have a personal brand, and how those personal brands then fit in with the company brand. I think that's a whole other space that companies are going to have to figure out. And I get it that it's scary because as a big company, there's a big company at risk, and there's a lot of brand reputation risk. And, if things go wrong, all of that. But that's where I think that dialogue around, okay, how are we going to behave in a way that lets you accomplish your objectives, that benefits the company, that is a win-win for everyone, those are conversations that need to be had in 2021 that didn't need to be had even 3 or 4 years ago, because there's just more tools.
Yeah, no, I definitely see that changing even in my personal experience, right? And I work for a big company, and we have unwritten rules of what I can write about and what I should not write about and what tone I should take. Do you see that changing more and more with more and more tools like Substack or, whatever, people are putting out more content? It's easier to put out tools, do a podcast.
Yeah, I do. And I will say this, I definitely took some inspiration from you, that you were working at a big company and writing your newsletter and had found a way to do it. So I'm like, there's gotta be a way to do this. So yeah, I definitely took some inspiration from that, but I think as there's more tools, as it's easier, as it becomes more clear how valuable it is to have an audience that moves with you through your career. That's a totally different ball game to think about, okay, my 1,500 person audience, like how that will, in an ideal world, if I continue creating value, right? Let's assume best case scenario, that will move with me through my career. And let's just assume, because no one stays at any company for 30 years, that will be across multiple companies. Yeah. That's a very different world than 30 years ago, where your Rolodex, your people that you could pick up the phone and call, that moved with you. But what was that? 50 people, 100 people? Let's go crazy and call it 200 people. Like that's a different world, And so it just creates such different dynamics. And I'm not indifferent to the fact that creates some challenges for companies and it's hard for them to navigate. I'm not indifferent to that challenge. But I think it's going to be a more common challenge that we're going to have to navigate. So.
Yeah, I think what I found is that if you are open to, as you said, like respecting those boundaries, understanding what those are, and educating your company as to what are the benefits of you doing it for them, I think that helps the conversation quite a bit. At least that's what I found in my personal experience.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned LinkedIn and you mentioned all these different tools. You're reasonably active on Twitter. I mean, you're not there all the time, but you're fairly active. Could you talk about that process? Like, do you probably don't edit your tweets? What's the role of Twitter in your overall writing process?
Yeah, I'm not super good at Twitter. I'm not super strategic about it. I also, I mean, I will say I get a lot more value probably than what I give. I don't tweet a ton. But I find that I'm always finding things on Twitter that's really helpful information, and so I try to really curate it to follow people that are giving interesting insight. As far as like using Twitter though, I'll be honest, I find it difficult as a female, right? I find that when I post some things, they're automatically going to be, especially sometimes in ag Twitter, there are going to be people that jump on and are like, jump straight to mansplaining. And so it's just not fun, right? It's just not enjoyable. That's not a forum where I find people behave particularly well or are particularly open to nuance. So then it kind of becomes a place where, So I share links there. I share some, some ideas sometimes, but it's not the most, it's not the place where I'm the most active, I guess I would say. I use LinkedIn more, or probably see more outcomes from LinkedIn where I share content there. So, and I mean, I guess I'll just say it. I think writing the longer form pieces is actually a really helpful way to build credibility. And whereas someone on Twitter is going to see like 140 characters and a female, I think that when you're writing a longer form piece and someone reads it and it's like, oh, they do know what they're talking about. Okay. So it's kind of a little bit of way of building up credibility in places where it might be a little bit harder to establish sometimes. And so that's why sometimes I'm like, Twitter's just not worth the fight, right? Like I want to be there for what I can see and what I can learn, but I'm not going to, debate the people about the things. I'm just going to write the whole story via my Substack, so I kind of use that as my place.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective on Twitter. I mean, I see it happen, but because I'm not a woman, I don't sort of feel and understand the effects the way you would. I mean, just a couple of weeks back, there was this whole controversy around somebody wrote about farm wives and it just blew up, and there was this nastiness. It was not fun at all.
Yeah.
So switching gears a little bit, you also published a book on Gumroad. Could you talk about the thought process there? Like, what was behind doing that?
Yeah. So this was that was like maybe summer, fall of last year. So before I had joined the company I'm with now, I was just doing independent consulting. And because I try to find the balance with my Substack of sometimes it's writing about things that I know, and sometimes it's writing about things I want to learn about. So I use it as like a forcing function. I'm going to go learn about this thing. And I was really wanting to dig in on just the venture capital side of investment around animal agriculture. And so I thought, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start kind of pre-selling this book. If I get enough people then that pre-order it, then I'll go and write it. If not, then, and then I also use hey, I'm writing this book. I use that as a way to go have conversations with probably 15 different VCs to say, hey, let's talk about this. Would love your insight for this project I'm working on. But my thought process was like, okay, if I don't get enough people that are interested in this, I'm not going to spend the time writing a book. I'll just write about it in prime future. Right. And that was kind of what ended up happening. I think it was like 10 people that bought it, and most of them were friends of mine. And so I was like, yeah, I'm not going to do this. So the good news is on Gumroad, it's so easy to use. I just refunded everyone their money. No big deal. Like, the only people that knew that I didn't write the book were the 10 people who I refunded their money. And so they weren't out anything, of course. And then other than that, like I didn't announce to the world I'm not writing a book. I just stopped talking about it. Right. So that was, it was a helpful process. then what I ended up doing was just packaging up, like, I think it was around the 50 newsletter mark. I ended up just I got someone off of Fiverr to package everything up into one ebook, put that on Gumroad. I didn't put a price on it, actually. I just said, pay whatever you want. You can pay $0 if you want. And people were actually very generous with that. So I have that out there. I will do some more ebook type things like that as I continue growing, but that's kind of my experience with the book.
Do you think you'll ever work on like a longer form, book which goes maybe deep into a particular set of topics that you care about?
Yeah, I will someday, but I think, probably not until I'm like, in my 50s or 60s. Yeah. I guess I think of it this way. Like, I want writing to supplement what I'm building now. And then down the road, like, write for the sake of writing. I think maybe that's how I think about it. Like, writing is kind of one part of my flywheel as I'm building and doing other things, but eventually, because that was the thing. Yeah, if I'm going to do a book, like, I want to do a book, and just the amount of time that it would take for that is like, I don't want to do that until I'm not trying to do other things as well. So,
right. Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the newsletter itself.
Yeah.
And clearly it helped you. It has helped you in your career even with your current job, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned you have some, few hundred subscribers. Are there specific things that you do for, growing your subscriber base? Like, do you worry about it? Could you talk about some of that process?
Yeah. I do have times where I do get caught up in like the number of subscribers, weekly growth, all of that. But really, thankfully, I have friends that pull me back and remind me, like, again, the reason I did this is finding meaningful connections with people who are interested in the things that I'm interested in. And so I have also a note in Evernote where I just keep track of like, what are the weekly outcomes? And I've had very few weeks go by where I didn't have someone reply to Prime Future and say, hey, Janette, really interesting topic. You need to meet so-and-so. Or, hey, I'd like to talk to you about XYZ, or, something along those lines. And so that's the value of writing for me in an industry like this. It's the connections that it opens up. It's the conversations that I get to have that I would never have had. Or it's the people that I had a conversation with when I was doing research that took the call that otherwise I just wouldn't have had a reason to connect with them. And now there's someone that like I can text them and we can, kick around ideas and that kind of thing. So I try to keep in mind, like, for me, that's the value. It's more about the quality of the engagements and connections I'm building as opposed to the quantity of subscribers.
What about do you sometimes get feedback like, hey, Janette, you like totally screwed this up. This is not right. Do you get that kind of feedback? And when you do that, if you do, how do you process that mentally and how do you follow up on those things?
So I don't know if this is good or bad. I don't typically get feedback like that. So there's kind of like this irony, right? I asked someone recently was telling me, they're like, oh, I really appreciate what you're writing. It's so great. And I asked the question, I was like, well, is there anything that I've written that you've disagreed with? And he kind of laughed and he was like, well, no, but also if you were writing things I disagreed with, I probably wouldn't subscribe. So there's a little bit of this irony, right? Of people who are self-selecting into Prime Future or people who share a fairly similar worldview, or at least are open enough to learning about that worldview. So maybe that says that I'm not pushing the envelope enough if there aren't people that are pushing back significantly. What I find though, is that people don't typically like reply and say, this is the dumbest thing I've ever read. They either unsubscribe or they forward it to their friends and say, this is the dumbest thing I've ever read. But I don't get a ton of that kind of critical feedback. I will sometimes, because my audience is, even though it's all animal ag, which sounds like a niche space, it's very diverse in the sense that I have some small producers, I have some large producers, and I have small and large producers across all the proteins. And then I have animal nutrition companies, animal health companies, meat processors, retail and food service companies, it's VCs, entrepreneurs, like it's all over the board. And so there's sometimes where I'm writing something that's more for one audience and the other audience doesn't really get much out of that. So there are times where I'm writing for founders and a producer isn't going to get much out of that. There are times where I'm writing for producers and, you know, some other a retailer is not going to get a lot out of that, for example. So I think I do try to navigate that dynamic. I don't have a good solution for it because I know you can't be all things to all people, but I want to try if I can, just, you know, staying focused on that bucket of animal ag and innovation, but knowing that there are a lot of stakeholders around that concept and that plays out in different ways. So anyway, I don't know that I answered your question, but thankfully I haven't had too many of those interactions of people saying, you know, hey, you really screwed this up.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's interesting how you think about who are you writing for, right? I mean, is that when you're writing a piece, are you actively thinking, oh, I'm writing for, you know, this type of a person? Or do you have a specific person in mind?
Yeah.
Could you talk about that process? In the last one, we discussed that quite a bit. Like, how do you think about your audience? So if you could talk about that.
Yeah. So this is one that, like, all of my marketing background says that I need to be really clear on who the persona is and I need to have that person in mind while I write. But then I come back to this fact that, like, what the producer is interested in is very different than what the VC who's just beginning to invest in animal ag, what they're interested in, right? And I want to be compelling for both of them over time. Maybe in every single piece, I'm not going to, you know, be compelling for both of them, but over time, I want both of them to get something from Prime Future. So kind of where I end up, to be honest, is, and I'm not saying this is the right answer. I'm just saying this is where I end up. Where I end up right now is I just write what's interesting for me. And I trust that because I have a fairly diverse set of hats that I wear, that because of that, if it's interesting for me, it will be interesting to some of those people who wear at least one of those diverse hats that I, you know, kind of think of the world through. So yeah, this is one that I'm constantly thinking about how narrow I need to go on dialing in who that audience is and who I'm writing for. And I constantly go in this loop of, I need to get more specific, but I want to be broad. Okay, so now I'm just going to write for me and hope that other people find that interesting. Like, that is a loop I have gone through a kabillion times in the last year and a half. Very cool.
Yeah, last maybe one or two questions. I don't know if there are any audience questions or not as well. You know, a lot of people who are writing newsletters now, right, with Substack and all that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think somebody did a survey, somebody said they subscribe to 50 newsletters. And so I want to sort of understand, you know, when you subscribe to other newsletters, what are you looking for? And what makes you hit that subscribe button? And doesn't have to be top, like your area that you write about, but what are the things which makes a newsletter attractive to you? Not yours, but somebody else's.
Right. So because I read the Wall Street Journal every day, there's 2 industry publications I read every day. I have, you know, let's call it 10 to 15 people on Twitter that I follow that I get a ton of value out of, just in how they think and their thought process. So because I feel like I'm pretty informed and I keep a pretty good beat on what people are saying, I have a really high bar on who I let in my inbox. And I say that even like, I mean, I don't give my email to brands unless I'm ordering something online. But like, if I'm in a retail store and they're like, oh, can I have your email? And I say, no, I don't give my email out. And if I do have to order something online, then I like unsubscribe from all of their emails immediately. Like, I'm just, in general, I'm very, very protective of my inbox. And so I just have a very high bar of what topics I let in. So, I mean, honestly, outside of your newsletter, Upstream Ag Insights and Magnetic Ag, so 3 ag sources, everything else from an industry standpoint, I just get when I want to go get it and where I want to go get it. Like, I'll find it on Twitter, I see it on LinkedIn, you know, whatever. So the most of the Substacks that I actually subscribe to are like outside the industry. They're just on topics that I'm interested in. I think that it does give me like really an appreciation for people who subscribe to my Substack, because I do have such a high bar for what I let into my inbox. And so, just knowing that there have also been Substacks that I subscribed to them for a few weeks and was like, oh, this is really great. I also can get that information on Twitter. And so I'm not going to subscribe. Like, I do that. And so I just am aware of, just being respectful of people who are subscribed to my newsletter and allow me, to deliver something to their inbox every week.
Very cool. I think that was sort of my last question. Are there any audience questions? If not, love to thank you for your time today, Janette. Any questions
Awesome.
from the audience here?
Oh yeah, Janette, I was going to ask, you said you have about 1,500 subscribers. I don't want to send you down the rabbit hole of like numbers of subscribers, but where did most of them come from? If you're not, I mean, you mentioned LinkedIn, but like what drives your subscriber growth?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it is largely LinkedIn. Like after I publish something, I share the link on LinkedIn and then other people share it. Largely LinkedIn and some Twitter. Those are the two main sources. I've had a few times I've had an industry publication pick something up and run it, and then they would link to subscribe to the newsletter. Doing like cross promotions with industry newsletters. I owe Rhishi a follow-up email on that, speaking of, but things like that. But for the most part, mine come from LinkedIn and Twitter to some degree, but largely LinkedIn and just people sharing.
Solid, thanks.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I think there's a question here. Have you done cross promotions with other independent writers? From Lyle?
Yeah. So I've done a couple. They're in our industry, like more broadly than animal agriculture, but just agriculture. There's probably 4 or 5, maybe 4, that are writing in a similar space. And so yes, doing like a cross promotion with them is definitely something that we've done. And then I also just try to like reference other people's writing in my analysis. I kind of prefer that as a way to highlight someone else's writing, but then also have my own spin on it. So I try to do that as well with some of those other independent writers. And, I know they have done the same. So, that has definitely been a way to grow as well.
Fantastic. Hey, Janette, thank you so much for your time. This was a lot of fun. As you can see, there are a bunch of notes coming on the side chat as well.
Awesome.
So I'm going to make a copy of that and share with the group. And this will get published in the next couple of days. But once again, thank you for your time. This was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Well, it was great to meet you finally, Rhishi, and it was great to meet all the rest of you. Best of luck in your writing.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.